It's one of the darkest pages in the history of the French capital of Paris. A scandal that erupted during the reign of Louis XIV. A mixture of plots, murders, an attempt on the king's life, poisonings, black masses, and sacrificed children. It's called the Affaire of the Poisons.
Okay, the Affaire of the Poisons. Now, I've mentioned this in a couple other videos in passing, but I thought I'd do a standalone version of it because it really teaches a lot of valuable lessons for today. Lessons about the application of power, the power of scandal and ill repute, and also the very nature of man, or rather, the leaders of men. Anyway, this whole nasty business transpired in the court of Louis XIV among his nobles, that is to say, his government. Now, you kind of got to understand a little bit about what's going on here with Louis. For years and years, hell, centuries, the French crown had had trouble with the aristocracy, the barons and the dukes and what have you, and they were always plotting rebellions and trying to undermine his leadership. And, you know, he kind of got tired of that. Louis came along, and so what he did was he practically bankrupted the country, and he built this huge, magnificent palace in Versailles, at Versailles. And then he made all of his nobles come and live with him at the palace, and he wouldn't let them go back to their estates. He made them stay right there with him, so he'd keep an eye on all of them. But the unique aspect of the whole shebang is that for the first time you had a concentration of these people all crammed together, all packed together in a single location, kind of like lots of rats in a cage, you know? And this is what happened. The true nature of these people came to the fore, and their true colors became evidenced. And this scandal, it almost, if it had been allowed to progress naturally, it would have brought down the king. But after it became apparent, after the scale of the whole thing became apparent, he shut down the investigation and sealed all the records, and that was the end of it. It's kind of like Epstein. All the perpetrators were punished and caught, but the people, their clients, they got a pass. No one ever knew who they were. Fortunately, though, one of the head honchos investigating the whole matter kept a separate ledger of notes regarding the investigation, and he hid it, and it was lost for so many years. And then in 1850, this one guy, he was redoing his floor, and he ripped up the floor, and there it was in the baseboards of his floor. And so it was a treasure trove of information regarding this whole sordid episode of French history, and I'm gonna go over a little bit of it and tell you a little bit about it because it's very interesting and it's piquant for today.
The Affaire of the Poisons was a series of scandals and poisonings that turned the court of the Sun King upside down. Many died in terrifying conditions. Black masses were held, invoking Satan. Rites were carried out on human bodies, and young children were sacrificed. The king himself was forced to intervene. The Affaire of the Poisons started with the uncovering of a first poisoner. And she wasn't just anyone. On July 17th, 1676, at 6 in the evening, hundreds of Parisians lined the streets to watch the passing of a cart which from Châtelet jail via Notre Dame Cathedral took the Marquise de Brinvilliers to the scaffold on the Place de Grève, where Paris's City Hall stands today. The Marquise de Brinvilliers was the daughter of nobles on both sides. She was accused of poisoning her father and brothers and attempting to poison her sister and niece, along with other victims, the number of whom remains unknown. The Marquise never confessed as to why. Nobody could have imagined a woman of the nobility behaving in such a way.
The Affaire of the Poisons was a series of scandals and criminal investigations that took place in France during the early 18th century, particularly between 1677 and 1682. The scandal revolved around accusations of poisonings, witchcraft, and heresy among the French aristocracy and courtiers. The most famous case was that of the midwife Catherine de Chez-Montvoisin, or La Voisin, who was arrested in 1679 after she was incriminated by the poisoner Marie Bosse. La Voisin implicated several important courtiers. These included Olympia Mancini, the Countess of Soissons, her sister, the Duchess of Bouillon, François-Henri de Montmorency, Duke of Luxembourg, and most importantly, the king's own mistress, Madame de Montespan. Questioned while intoxicated, La Voisin claimed that Montespan had bought aphrodisiacs and performed black masses with her in order to gain and keep the king's favor over rival lovers. There is an actress who played Montespan. There's a TV series called Versailles. It's 2 seasons, and in the second season, they cover the scandal, the Affaire of the Poisons, kind of in depth, and it was, from what I can tell, it was actually pretty historically accurate. So if you want to learn some more about the whole period, watch that series. It's called Versailles, and I think it's maybe on Netflix, maybe on Amazon. But there's the actress who played her, and then there's a little cameo there of how she apparently appeared in real life, as well as drawings and paintings back then could. And you'll see toward the end, I'm going to talk about how the king's brother was implicated years later. So you see, this whole thing had the potential of doing some splash damage on the king himself. Perhaps the king was involved. Who knows? But anyway, as I said, after a certain point, the king shut it down.
This investigation would eventually lead to one of the worst serial killers in French history. Catherine Dehaye, a.k.a. La Voisin, lived and worked in her store at 23 to 25 Rue Beauregard in the capital's 2nd arrondissement. La Voisin presented herself as a former midwife, but she also practiced abortions, read cards, and told fortunes. At the same time, as a good Christian, she would dedicate herself to novenas, devotional prayers repeated for 9 consecutive days. La Voisin also sold lotions, potions, ointments, and poisons of all sorts. Members of the Paris upper class, mostly ladies, visited her dispensary to get rid of an overbearing husband, a bothersome lover, or a rival in love.
Satanism was indeed involved in the Affaire of the Poisons. Many of the suspects were accused of practicing witchcraft, sorcery, and other forms of Satanism as a part of their alleged crimes. Some of the accused were believed to be members of secret societies dedicated to Satan, while others were accused of black magic to gain power, wealth, and influence. The use of poisons, curses, and other supernatural means was thought to be a common practice among these Satanists in their attempt to control the French court. Some of the accused were believed to be practicing devil worshippers who engaged in horrific rituals, including the performance of black masses. These masses were thought to involve the desecration of the Eucharist, sexual acts, and other forms of blasphemy and sacrilege. There were allegations of baby sacrifices during the Affaire of the Poisons. The rumors of babies being sacrificed were part of a broader accusations of witchcraft and Satanism that were leveled against many of the accused individuals. A police report detailed the discovery of 2,500 dead babies buried on the grounds of one of the principals. So in other words, these guys thought that by doing black magic and praying to the devil and shit like that they could somehow or another influence the course of state, the head of state, and control the government, control world history. That's what they thought, and by God, that's what they were doing.
Women lay naked, a black candle in each hand, on what constituted the altar of these macabre masses. Babies had their throats slit on these women's stomachs. Their blood was poured into a chalice. Satan was then invoked so that a good deed or bad deed towards another be fulfilled. It's said that next, the baby's entrails and heart were collected for the making of poisons. As crazy as it might sound or read, these black masses did exist.
The poison affair implicated 442 suspects. 367 orders of arrest were issued, of which 218 were carried out. Of the condemned, 36 were executed, 5 were sentenced to the galleys, and 23 to exile. This includes those who died in custody by torture or suicide. Additionally, many accused were never brought to trial, but placed outside of the justice system and imprisoned for life by lettres de cachet. Lettres de cachet, that was a way of locking somebody up without having to go through the courts. The king wrote the letter up, and at least one of his cabinet had to sign it. And then once they'd done that, they could lock somebody up for the rest of their life. And it was done extrajudicially, so there wasn't any need for trial or witnesses or anything. People involved in the poison affair, by being clients, were mostly aristocrats and for the most part not punished despite overwhelming evidence, since Louis shut down the investigation when the full extent of the network began to be known. There is even evidence that the network extended into England. So right there, you've got a multinational network of Satanists, because it was an English aristocrat that participated in one of the black masses. He didn't just participate, he set the whole thing up and bankrolled it. But anyway, as you can see, it was a really big deal.
It was then that Louis XIV brought an abrupt end to proceedings. He closed the burning chamber and gave the order for everything to disappear. Hundreds of pages of court records, correspondence, statements, and reports.
And flash forward to 1718, Philip II, Duke of Orleans, he was the king regent. He was the practicing king while the young Louis XV was still a kid. And they dredged this up and accused him too. This might actually just be a wicked attempt at discrediting and undermining his rule, I think maybe. But nonetheless, there were some of these people from years earlier, they dragged out their testimony, supposedly, and said that he was involved too. Now, this is what I'm leading up to. Do you think that people are any different now than they were then? Do you really think that they got all of these people and that none of them escaped? Do you really think that people weren't doing this shit all over Europe? Remember the English aristocrat who was involved? And if it was going on back then to that extent, who's to say it's not going on today? In fact, if you're going to use Occam's razor, the simplest explanation would be that it is going on today. We just don't know where, when, how. But to say that you don't think this is happening today is very naive. And I think probably the only reason they caught all these people is because they were congealed into that palace at Versailles, living in such close proximity to one another. And it was just a whole lot easier to catch them because they were all right there under closer scrutiny. Because after all, they were there to be watched. That's why they were there. They brought them there so the king and the secret police keep an eye on them and make sure they weren't plotting revolts and rebellions. So they were being watched. And that's the first time that had ever happened, to my knowledge, in all of human history. And so they caught him. Do you really think that they wouldn't have been doing this back on their estates by themselves? Huh? And then you have other stories like Elizabeth Báthory in Hungary, who was killing young virgin girls and bathing in their blood and having all kinds of orgiastic devil worship. You know, these people were corrupt. But what makes you think for an instant that the people who are ruling us now aren't just as corrupt as they were? The dark and the light progress through history hand in hand. They both exist, they both coexist within the same dimensions, but they're both there. And I think it's incumbent upon all decent men to keep that in mind and do their best to oppose this sort of rank.
Well, we are still terrified today of this affair, with its long line of witches, warlocks, black masses, and so on. We must remember that these practices didn't disappear with the reign of Louis XIV, and that they still exist today. We don't live in an entirely rational era. However much technology there is still practices today which go back to ancient times, in which in our eyes are totally reprehensible. And so we need to ask questions.